From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Last Wednesday, on a sunny afternoon in DC, President Trump walked into the White House Rose Garden.
Yeah, so it's 9 o'clock UK time. I was double screening, had the football on one, had Bloomberg TV, shout out Bloomberg, on the other one. And we've been waiting for this. It was a long day and financial markets were kind of all over the place. My whole day was just sort of in anticipation of 9 o'clock.
Very, very good news today, and a lot of good things are happening for our country. Please sit down.
Trump comes out into the Rose Garden. He's flanked by his usual sort of cabinet ministers.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time.
There's a adoring audience waiting for him, made up of, I think, US auto workers and other Trump supporters.
If you want to do that, I'd like to see the chart if you have it. Could you bring it up, Howard? This is our great Secretary of Commerce.
So Trump puts up this board, this piece of cardboard that he's handed by Howard Lutnick, his trade secretary.
I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad eyes. We didn't want to bring, it's very windy out here, we didn't want to bring out the big charts because it had no chance of standing.
And he reads out the tariffs, and there's two columns. One is what these countries apparently apply to the US, so their protectionism on US goods, and what Trump is going to respond with. And the whole point of this is for the US to retaliate or to reciprocate with equal protectionism that Trump is saying that other countries apply on the US. Now, that is a particular version of reality, which I think is a stretch, and we can talk about why, but that's the logic driving these tariffs, that we're only doing to other countries what they've been doing to us, and it's time to put an end to this so-called unfairness.
Is Donald Trump right that there's an unfairness that needs to be addressed? Or is this huge experiment in a new global economy built on a false premise? The story today: the problem with the economic theory behind Trump's tariffs.
My name is Mehreen Khan, and I'm the economics editor at The Times.
Mehreen, like you, I was really struck by that board that they brought out. It looked sort of hastily constructed. So just drill down into some of the details around the tariffs. So what's actually been unveiled?
So what's a tariff? I think let's start there. A tariff is essentially a tax, a border tax on a good coming into a country, and goods. So we're not talking about services, which for some countries like the UK is great because we sell loads of services to the US and we have a services massive surplus with them.
And that's exempt at the moment.
That's not included. So everything I'm going to talk about when I talk about deficits and tariffs applies to goods. So just stuff that crosses borders from one country to another. Yeah. And you apply a tariff on that. So we know that every country are going to be subject to a 10% tariff on anything coming into the US. So that's British goods, that's goods from Gibraltar. And then there's some countries that are going to get this extra, so this reciprocal thing. So this extra level of tax. So we've heard for the last 2 months that the Trump administration is working really hard to come up with this really complicated exercise of trying to measure tariff and non-tariff barriers that the US suffers from. Non-tariff barriers is just a way of saying things that aren't an import tax, so regulations, standards, maybe VAT, another one, taxation in other forms. That's quite a complicated task, but this is what we were promised. What we got instead was a bizarre set of calculations and numbers based on, it took a long time for anyone to understand what they were. It turns out it's just based on a really crude formula, which is taking a country's deficit with the US, then dividing it by the value of exports that country sells to the US. That's the number. He then halves it in two, and that's the magical tariff.
How do you think you get to such a random formula?
I wouldn't say it's a random formula, but it's been reverse engineered to achieve a particular goal. The goal that Trump wants to achieve is that he no longer wants the US to run trade deficits with anyone. He wants the US to be selling more than it buys with every single country it trades with. My speculation is that Trump asked his team to do this a couple of months ago. They realised it was impossible and really hard to come up with a number that calculates tariff and non-tariff barriers. And instead of just telling him, they sort of just strung him along. And then it was like 2 weeks before April 2nd and then 1 week before April 2nd. And they don't really have anything. They don't have a document to produce because it's really difficult to calculate and quantify non-tariff barriers. So instead, they come up with a formula which people, not me, have gone on to ChatGPT and realised that ChatGPT, if you ask it, what's the way to calculate a trade deficit or a trade barrier, comes up with this entire formula.
You're kidding.
And they presented it to Trump and he's like, let's run with it. It's pretty simple. I understand it. If I can understand it, Americans can understand it. And that's what we're going with.
Sorry, so every stage of that, the dividing by two, really randomly out of the blue, all of this is basically the formula that ChatGPT came up with.
It is definitely a formula which, if you prompt it in a certain way, ChatGPT will tell you that that's a way to do it. And the reason that some countries only get 10% is because if you do that formulation calculation for the UK, for example, where we run a trade surplus with the US, you can't come up with a number that's as high as Lesotho's or Indonesia's. It's a negative number, so we just get 10%. But then there's this special category of countries who do run a bigger trade deficit, and they're being hit the hardest. The thing that surprised me the most is that the one economy that we haven't heard that much about in the first couple of months of Trump is China. And all of a sudden, we have a whole series of tariffs which affect China massively and affect China's neighboring economies, Vietnam, Cambodia, South Korea, Japan. They are actually probably the biggest victims of this bizarre tariff formulation, along with really, really poor countries, some of which are in Africa, and then jurisdictions like the Marshall Islands and tiny places where only penguins live and there really aren't even any humans. They all get caught up in this formula because if you apply the formula in the way that it's been applied, it just gives you this weird set of numbers.
Wow. So basically there's a blanket 10% tariff on everyone. Some countries have it much, much worse. Give us a sense of how bad the really bad ones are. So you mentioned China and some of the countries around China. How high will their tariff level be if they're trying to send goods into America?
Let's just focus on China because China is super unique because it's got added extras. So China's already subject to an existing 20% tariff, which is a legacy of the Biden administration and some of the things Trump's already announced. Then on April the 2nd, they get an extra 38%. So that gives us 58%. It's added on top. 58% for all goods in China, all goods from China going to the US. Then China gets an extra category of punishment if it buys oil from Venezuela. And then the US government says it's going to add it up even more, jack it up by another 25%. So if all of these categories are met, Chinese goods sold into the US could be subject to a 79% tariff. Now, that is by far and away the highest of any country, single country in the world. It happens to be the world's
79% tax on any good coming in. So you're not just paying the price of the good, 79% of it added on top.
And if it's an electric vehicle, it's already 100% tariff. So we know that, and that's the legacy of the Biden administration. So China gets special treatment. Why does China get special treatment? In some ways, pretty obvious. World's biggest manufacturer, moving into high-end manufacturing that threatens America's sort of hegemonic position in the global economy. And there are lots and lots of hawks all around the US administration, both Democrats and Republicans, who want to sort of knock China off its economic perch. Then there's this second category of countries that I think have really been dealt a bad hand, who actually have been beneficiaries of the fact that China's economy is having to change. So you had lots of companies that were leaving China and basing themselves in things like Vietnam and Cambodia because they were worried about tariffs. Now they're also going to get hit by tariffs. Nike, one of the biggest sportswear brands in the world, sells sneakers and athleisure and clothes all over the world, but to the US market. They produce almost half of their sneakers in Vietnam. They are now going to be subject to a tariff of nearly 50%.
Oof.
And their whole reason that Nike is based in Vietnam is because it's not China. Retail manufacturing is also big in Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, but has a relative competitive advantage in producing clothing and textiles for the world. They're also going to get whacked by a massive tariff. Cambodia is the same. So these satellite economies near China that have benefited from some of the changes in global trade and really just didn't want to be caught up in the crossfire of a US-China trade war are now caught up in the crossfire of a global trade war.
And what about countries like Canada and Mexico? Because we'd heard a lot about tariffs in terms of both of those before. How did they fare?
So weirdly, that was one of the other sort of omissions. We didn't hear anything about them. And it took a while after the press conference to understand what the position of Canada and Mexico were. So they weren't subject to this minimum 10%. And in the end, what's happened is that they've been exempted from the weird formula tariff. Let's call it. Everyone else has got a weird formula tariff, but Canada and Mexico are special because we already knew that they were going to be subject to a 20 to 25% tariff that had been announced by Trump last month, and they're going to stay there. So nothing really changes for those two countries. That's not to say that this is necessarily great news, because they're still potentially going to be falling into recessions, both of them, because they're so trade reliant on the US. Their level of trade integration with the US is so high. But they weren't part of this. They're in a special category of their own. So you could say there was a little bit of a reprieve from the US's two closest neighbours, Mexico and Canada. But as far as I can tell, at the time of recording, the only two countries not to be hit with any kind of tariff are Russia and North Korea.
Why is it that the Russians and the North Koreans?
There are two very odd countries to single out to not impose tariffs on. As it stands, we have not got an explanation from the White House about why this is the case. If I'm going to be super generous, you could just argue that North Korea and Russia are both basically subject to huge amounts of financial sanctions and trade sanctions, which mean there isn't much trade. North Korea doesn't trade with anyone. In some ways, it's probably the economy that Trump is aspiring to be like, completely cut off from global trade. And Russia's obviously been subject to this entire system of financial sanctions. However, it's still weird that Israel, the US's most important ally financially, if you think about it, is subject to the 10%. Syria, a country that is barely, still going through a very painful process of regime change and administrative change, is also subject to a tariff. So everyone gets a tariff, Laos and Marshall Islands and Guadeloupe and tiny places where few people live, but Russia, one of the most populous countries in the world, is not there. So you can imagine that there has been some other kind of diplomatic wrangling about why not to put Russia on the list. Ukraine, however, I should mention, is on the list and does get the 10% minimum.
So do you think because of the sanctions, when they just put them into the ChatGPT formula, it came out as zero?
Maybe the sanctions are a non-tariff barrier that broke the formula.
What's the fallout been already? Because, as you say, the markets preempting it were fearful. Now we've seen them respond. How is it looking?
So the day after we hear about the tariffs, the dollar suffers its worst one-day fall since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Wow.
Now, it's worth dwelling on this because this is the opposite of what is supposed to happen when the US government imposes tariffs. When the US government has imposed tariffs in the past, including in 2018, 2019, the dollar rises. And the dollar usually rises when there's a lot of uncertainty about the world economy because it's a safe haven. Even if the US is the reason that there's lots of chaos in the world, the dollar still benefits. The fact that we've had such a sharp decline in the dollar, I think, reflects, one, the bizarre nature of the application and the calculations behind the tariffs, as we've spoken of, weird formula vibes. And the other one, that this actually reflects a much more, I would use the word unhinged or uncontrolled experiment with global trade. And it's really important what the dollar does, because if you speak to Trump's officials, they say one of the reasons our economy is not going to be hit too hard or inflation is not going to be too high is the dollar will rise after we impose tariffs. And that's a counterbalance to the economic hurt that maybe the tariffs will cause. And they're right. They have been right in the past. That's the relationship. But if the dollar is falling the way that it is, that will only exacerbate the harmful inflationary impacts that the US economy could suffer as a result of this. So the market reaction is not just a kind of interesting sideshow. It's actually a super important part of the economic dynamics that have been unleashed by a global tariff war, and how Americans and American businesses are going to suffer because of things like a falling dollar.
The reaction of the stock markets has also been brutal. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq have suffered their worst single-day loss since 2020, basically since the onset of the pandemic. And that rout is only accelerating because countries like China are responding in kind with their own tariffs. So this basically looks and sounds a lot like a global trade war. And the response of people with money in the market is to very much pull them out of US companies and any listed companies because they're worried about growth. So when you're worried an economy is going to hit into a recession, the first thing you do is take your money out of companies who are very much exposed to economic growth and try and put them in safe places. One of the safe places they're not putting them in, however, is the dollar. And that's just a reflection, I think, of the level of panic and concerned that the Trump administration is not going to be listening to the stock market. He's not going to be listening to his friends on Wall Street. And this is an ideologically driven attempt to sort of change the DNA of the US economy.
If I was sitting here 4 or 5 months ago, I would tell you that the US economy is the strongest advanced economy in the world. It has an envious labour market, productivity growth that we would, chop your right hand off in the UK to have that level. They've managed to reduce inflation from very, very high levels to around 2% without causing too much economic pain. They were, as The Economist said a few months before the election, the envy of the world. And all of a sudden, all of that is potentially going down the drain because of this extreme experiment and high risk or high stakes gamble with tariff policy.
Mehreen, given the risks this policy poses, and you've already described how badly it's going down with the markets, many people listening will be wondering why on earth the Trump administration thought it would be a good idea. So just talk us through, in theory, what does he think the problems are with the current American system? As you say, everyone else thinks it's the envy of the world. It has great economic growth and productivity. For him, what's the problem with now that he's trying to fix?
So he's not an economist, and I think his views about what's good or bad are very much driven like how a businessman thinks, in a very transactional way. So in a really basic sense, he doesn't like the fact that the US runs a trade deficit. Why? What is a trade deficit? A trade deficit just means the US is buying more from everyone else than it's selling to everyone else. That's the deficit. Now, he thinks that because the US runs a trade deficit with Canada, that the US, and he says it, is subsidizing Canada, that it's subsidizing Canadian industry.
Explain that. Why is it subsidizing?
Because I think he thinks that if you give money to someone for the stuff that they're selling you, but they're not buying the similar amount of stuff, that means you're effectively giving them a free ride. That's how he sees it, the transaction between a country in trade terms.
Even though you're getting a product from them.
Indeed, and it's a very good product. Often it's energy or raw materials or metals. It's basically stuff you don't have and stuff that you need, and they produce it cheaply, and they're your neighbours and you trust them and you like them, and they're generally non-problematic, right?
But he sees that as somehow subsidising their industry.
He thinks he's subsidising the Canadian welfare state, or like Canada's wokeness or Canada's progressivism. There's a lot going on with Canada. It's complicated. But it's a sense, and he thinks that they're getting ripped off because why aren't they buying as much stuff as we're buying from them, right? Now, that's not how most people think. That's not how the conventional view of trade deficits work. I would say that that version of I'm subsidizing the rest of the world because I run a deficit is actually the opposite of the truth. The truth is that the rest of the world subsidizes the US. Now, why do I say that? Because in economics, there's a fundamental rule that everything has to balance out. If you're running a trade surplus, somebody else has to run a deficit. They have to balance to zero. Now, the US has been running deficits in its budget, i.e. it spends way more than it earns in tax revenues for the last, let's say, the last 30 years.
They live on debt.
They live on debt, exactly. And how can you live on debt? You rely on someone, like, let's use the household analogy. You rely on someone to fund that debt. You rely on the bank to give you the loans, right? And they do it to you because they know you're going to pay back in the end. They think you're credible.
America is in a rare position like that, because if this was a household and you were getting money from a bank, you'd be paying quite a bit of interest. America has very favourable interest rates because they seem so credible.
And their budget deficit is 7% of GDP. So we're running into trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. Now, why is the rest of the world always willing and able and wanting to lend to the US? One, because they think it's a super credible country. They think it's a safe country to lend to. It's a country that generates economic growth. It's a country that has reasonably favourable demographics compared to especially aging countries around the rest of the world. It's a bet on the US being good and doing good and performing well.
The bet on the American future.
Indeed. And let's think about what happens when a country decides it doesn't want to do that. In the UK, we kind of know how that feels because Liz Truss was not someone that the markets wanted to lend to. And she had a very, very ill-fated 48-day premiership where her economic experiment exploded very quickly because she tested her finances, the rest of the world, and they were like, yeah, we don't like the look of you. In the US, it's different. Because they have the dollar, because they have this status that is unrivaled in the world economy, they're always going to get that. So they're always going to be subsidized by the rest of the world. Their own savings do not match their own consumption, so they have to borrow. And they've been able to borrow at will at super low rates for as long as I've been alive. And that generosity has never been tested. So to say that the system is designed to make the US lose is very odd when you think about the fact that the rest of us are financing that deficit in perpetuity, and basically they can do whatever they want.
And at very low rates, so it really is like subsidizing their debt.
And we're never going to cause a Liz Truss financial crisis in the US because ultimately the US is the US and we don't have an option but to lend to the US. So is the US subsidizing the rest of the world, or have we been subsidizing the US? And by doing that subsidy, we allow them to run budget deficits, and we allow them to have super expansive fiscal policy, and we allow them to have tax cuts, and we allow them to have their booming economy at very little cost to them. So I think that's where the upside down nature of what Trump is arguing is really, you sort of hit the sharp end of who's the loser. I would say that we've designed a global financial and trade system where the US has been the biggest beneficiary, with some caveats, but yes, the biggest beneficiary.
And that's all sort of looking shaky now. I mean, given that America is a country that, as you say, relies on loans, it relies on people buying its debt, it lives off that debt, this will seem like a hell of a risk. What does he think he'll achieve by having a trade surplus? I mean, does that mean he is hoping to wipe off the debt? I mean, how does this play out?
So he's determined to go from being a deficit country to a surplus country. He wants to be less like the US and more like China. Okay, let's work through how you get to that place. One is, of course, by forcing other countries to stop selling to you, right? Or to make it really hard for them to sell to you and really expensive for them to sell to you. And what you do is you substitute those goods. So all the things that American companies buy, the little widgets to go into their machineries, the raw materials, some of the chips, the energy, the cheap garments, things that the US doesn't produce anymore, bananas, things that Americans don't produce, some of which are physically impossible for America to produce, you have to substitute for them.
So you put a tariff on them so that they become less competitive.
Completely prohibitive.
You hope that America can start to produce them themselves?
Yeah, somehow like banana trees just
all over Milwaukee.
Yeah, somewhere. Like somehow we discover amazing exotic fruits in Wisconsin and nobody remembers the bananas that they used to eat in the 2020s. So this autarkic idea that we could do this better ourselves, but if we do it better ourselves, we're less reliant on other people, and also we get jobs. Americans start making stuff again. We're great again like we were under William McKinley, right? So again, it's down to that mercantilist idea about what economic strength looks like. And the irony is that the American economy is really, really good at producing stuff and is really good at producing high-end stuff. They have a technology sector that is the envy of the world. That is where their productivity growth comes from. They have this huge, incredibly lucrative tech sector, which makes massive profits and reinvests so much of that into R&D, so innovation. America has so many brilliant things going for it. But Trump wants to have other things going for it. And let's talk about what exactly are the manufacturing jobs he wants to bring back. Because I think what he thinks is all these jobs are really high paid and high skilled and high productivity. But if you ultimately want to cut yourself off from the global trading system and like I said, grow your own bananas, that means you also got to make all the crappy stuff that you want Americans to be making? Cheap garments, some of the tools and the widgets that go into the machines that make the cars, things that other countries which have cheap labor have specialized in and which is just much easier to get from them because you don't want Americans to be toiling away in factories making crappy things. Is that the American dream? Is that the Gilded Age? Maybe in the 19th century it was, but I think in the 21st century, people's ideas of what it means to live a good life, their standards of living, what they would like to go to when they go to work, what they would like to do, is at a much higher level than this sort of, as I said, antediluvian view of what economies are supposed to be looking like because they make stuff. If you want to make stuff, you have to make everything. And some of that stuff is just kind of, as I said, sort of crappy low-end stuff. And America's really good at making really, really good high-end stuff.
So this is basically telling the Rust Belt that there'll be manufacturing in the country again. Factories will reopen, people will be making things and selling them around the world, but they might end up being the things that they were buying cheaply from Bangladesh, cheap underwear, cheap garments. growing bananas, things that people in the Rust Belt don't necessarily want to be doing.
And your incredible services sector. We've been talking only about goods. Americans are fantastic at selling services. Are you going to tell the consultant at McKinsey that now actually he's going to have to run a factory floor managing people, making tiny little widgets, because that's the future of the American economy? Right? Are you really going to achieve this actual sea change in how people think or think about their relationship to work and what good work is and what productivity is and why making stuff is better than just doing stuff we're already good at? Financial services, education, the knowledge sector, all of these things that American economy is very, very good at and has been generating jobs in. And all the things I've told you are some things he thinks he can achieve. But if you really want to become a surplus country, you're so determined to get to that status, you need to reduce your 7% GDP budget deficit down to zero and into positive territory.
How do you do that in a hurry?
Well, Doge wants to cut a few trillion of US government debt and US government spending. If you're that committed to being a surplus country, you would have to carry out the biggest experiment in austerity that has ever been seen in the world.
Wow.
So that means cutting Medicaid and Medicare. That means cutting your precious defense spending budget, which is already a third of US spending. That means reducing all the goodies that Americans are used to. That means drastically cutting the size of the state. That means maybe having a minuscule amount of federal employees. That is a complete overturning of your economic model to one that is about suppressing domestic demand by keeping your domestic economy running way below capacity. So the only way you generate growth is through your manufacturing. And that is turning America's economic model since the post-war era, since the 1950s, completely on its head. And in the short, medium, and long term, all I think that is a recipe for is incredible amounts of economic pain, just so at the end you can achieve this magical surplus status. And the big question right now is, what is Trump's pain tolerance? How much is he willing to put the stock market through, to put American businesses through, to American households through his own allies through? Because ultimately, he's still a politician. He looks at polls. He used to be obsessed with his popularity, a bit less so now. How much pain is he willing to put Americans and the economy through just so he can achieve this sacred status of being a surplus country, which I would say is a completely fabricated status, or he's attached a moral kind of value to this. It's a kind of chauvinistic aim. And I don't think anyone you could really speak to would say the pain is going to be worth it.
If Trump doesn't change his mind, if he doesn't roll back these tariffs, can the rest of the world survive without the world's largest economy being part of the system?
So as cataclysmic as I think this could be for Americans, I think the rest of the world, if people don't lose their heads, can manage. Why do I say that? America's very big. It's clearly now a bully, but it's also a super closed economy. So even China, the world's biggest manufacturer, only 3% of its exports go to the US. That's not very much at all. In the UK, it's about 15%. In the EU, on average, it's just a bit less than 20%. But can you see a world where, take the US out of it, the world's classic free trading nations, so the European Union, the rest of the G7, Japan, China, very importantly, decide that, okay, this guy in the White House doesn't want to deal with us. What we're going to do is try and make sure that trade is still open and free between us. We're actually going to increase our trade linkages with you, China, for example. I think that's a super conceivable thing to do. It will require a lot of political will, a lot of diplomatic effort, and an agreement among these countries that this is the way forward. But yeah, of course, we can design a global trading system which has the US as a marginal player, not the central player. Trump could be forcing the rest of the world to coalesce and cooperate without the US. And in this situation, the Americans are definitely the worst off. I think this is a situation where the US suffers the most. American businesses, American tourists, American consumers, and the rest of us can probably just manage as long as there's enough political will behind creating a system where the US is marginal. It's a complete, paradigm shift to everything we've been used to, but I don't think it's beyond the wit of any of these countries.
That was the economics editor for The Times, Mehreen Khan. If you want to hear more from Mehreen, do check out her incisive column that drops every Tuesday at thetimes.com. Today's episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard or any ideas for future episodes, do drop us a line to thestory at thetimes.com. And if you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.